Hey everyone, it's Dr. Tracy. This video is to help me walk you through what we are going to cover this week. This week is working with the document object model. Now, the document object model is a very important aspect of JavaScript because basically what it does is it breaks down every element on a web page into something that can be modified according to its attributes or events that it can interact with. So when you look at the overview here, the browser object model and the document object model, they're two different things, but they're very related. The browser object model relates to the page and the address and whether it's opened or closed and where you came from before you came to this page and where you went to. The document object model deals with headers and paragraphs, lists, images, and any other element that is on the page. By using these object models, you're able to reference some of the basic properties and methods of the objects and browsers in a document. Being able to reference some of these basic properties and methods of objects in the browser and in a document allows you to modify them and create dynamic pages that JavaScript does very well. So in this chapter, you learn how to add and remove nodes and open and close browser tabs and look at other objects that are within these objects: history, location, navigator, screen objects. The project in the chapter is a photo gallery application. So here's the objectives. The main idea of being able to access elements by ID, tag name, class, name, or selector is put about by having a document object model. So when you're able to call on a paragraph, for example, and affect that one individually by changing its style or position or visibility, then you're pulling it as long as it has an ID. You can also change CSS properties and attributes when you're able to select each of these individual elements. Let's take a look at the PowerPoint. Okay, so when you look at a single web page, it is treated as a set of related components, and each one of those things would be objects. In this way, JavaScript is an object-based language. It's not an object-oriented programming language. It's an object-based scripting language. The difference there is that while it uses objects, the objects are created through something else. And while it does base objects on methods and behaviors, it translates that back to a different source. In this case, we're using HTML as the other source, although JavaScript can be used in a variety of different ways through different engines. Game engines sometimes use JavaScript in order to manipulate the objects. There are servers that use JavaScript in order to manipulate the elements within a network. So there's other ways to apply JavaScript besides just to web pages, but web page is the most common. JavaScript doesn't stand on its own. So when you create these objects, then you can manipulate them. The window object is another object. It represents the web browser window. And it's called a global object because it relates to every page within a website. This is kind of the hierarchy of the browser object model. Not kind of, it is. So there's a window object, and in that window object you can find the history, the location, navigator, screen, and document. So this gives like the page title. This is talking about the size. This is talking about the browser that's being used. This is talking about the website and where it's stored on the server. And the history is where you were before you got to this page. The document object model represents all of the elements within the web page itself. So the document object model, since it allows you to change the content of those objects without having to reload, it changes HTML to be dynamic. The term DHTML is simply the combination of HTML with JavaScript using the document object model. Because when I can affect a certain area of one web page without having to reload that web page, that's dynamic. And using the document object model, you can call by an ID or by an element and make a modification that will be changed automatically based on an event, such as a time or a click. This is an example of the document object model hierarchy. You can see in each one of these, if we indent, it makes sense to show that within the document there is an HTML tag. That becomes an element if you change that to anything else. There's also a head tag and a body tag. In the head section, that also can be an element. And in here, there's a title. You could change any one of these things dynamically, like the header or H1, just by changing the source of what's in between those tags. This shows a document object model tree of the thing that was just being looked at. For each of the titles, there are text and attributes. These are what can be modified through the use of JavaScript. Each item is called a node, and each node has an attribute and or something that could be modified in that example. This is how you change them or select them as objects. Using the get element by ID, if you add an ID equals to any one of those tags, or get element by class name, returns a collection of elements. You can say get elements by name if you have a name equals within the attributes in the tag. Get elements by tag name, returns all of the elements. Say you wanted all of the heading ones in your entire page to turn blue. You could say get elements by tag name H1 and then apply the JavaScript that changes the cascading style sheet style. And then query select or all returns a collection of elements that match whatever the selector criteria is. And we can use the write text function to change the text between tags. There's some other things that you can do with this document object property. Each one of these things that are listed in table 5-2 shows what you can modify when you're able to select each of these objects from the document object model. To access those, you just find the proper get element by function that will choose the objects within the page and select them in this way. Like for example, if there's an input and there's an ID equal to zip, then I can say document dot get element by ID and put zip in there, which refers to here, and now it will reference that particular input type in order to make modifications. If you say get input by tag name, then you'd say, like this example, H1. You can write them according to which one. This says number 1, but it starts at 0, so that would mean the second H1 tag in the page. This one uses the example of side if we establish a class value within an element. And a class is just a style that can be reused. So this is what the example of that. And by name, if you name something, you put the name into the tags, but note this is not standard in earlier versions. I'm going to stop there because I think, here's an example of selector all. This says select all nav ul li. That means it's looking for all of these elements of lists that are within an unordered list within a nav tag. But I'm going to stop there because I don't want to make this video too long. But I think this gives an overview of what the document object model is and what it does. It's going to continue in this chapter by looking at some of the elements' contents and how to make modifications to those using an example. Follow through with the example. And if you have any questions, please let me know and I'll do what I can to help you with that. So have a good week and talk to you next week.